Chapter 71. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The next morning, sunlight streamed onto the ocean, the water shimmered like golden fish scales, reflecting the light. It was a little blinding, but so peaceful. Hod and Wanda lay in the big bed, sunlight painting their cheeks a soft rose color. They looked at each other, smiles playing on their lips. You're such a schemer. But fine, maybe you're right. Wanda sighed. She was still a little hesitant, but it didn't sound so bad after she had time to think about it. At the very least, she would have another sister to hang out with. She didn't exactly have a lot of close friends in the Avengers. Which, you're the best. Hod hugged Wanda tight, planting a noisy kiss on her cheek. He felt incredibly lucky to have her. After breakfast, Hod remembered Lorna was still at the manor. Hey, I've got another surprise for you, Hod whispered to Wanda as she leaned against him. He hadn't forgotten Lorna. After all, Lorna was practically Wanda's sister, and he knew she would be thrilled. Family meant everything to Wanda. She was devoted to her relatives and friends. And she was lonely, deep down. Surprise? Wanda perked up, sitting up straight and giving Hod a suspicious look. You're sure it's not shocking? There aren't any other women you haven't told me about, are there? That she'd said having more sisters would be great, but she didn't want a bombshell dropped on her. That would really upset her. He just shouldn't go too far. Hod's mouth twitched. It's a good surprise, I promise. That he couldn't figure out how her woman's intuition was so sharp. Sometimes he thought women had some kind of spider sense. She was voicing his thoughts before he even had a chance to. It was a little embarrassing. It better be. Wanda pouted, giving Hod a playful glare. Buzz. Star. Her phone suddenly started vibrating insistently on the table. Okay. I understand. Wanda answered the call, her expression turning serious as she hung up. What's wrong? Hod noticed her face and asked, concerned. Wanda wasn't usually this serious. Natasha said she needs to talk to me about something important. Wanda took Hod's hand, looking apologetic. Sorry, the surprise will have to wait until I'm free. Natasha's tone had been urgent. It couldn't be anything small. She wanted to spend time with Hod, but she couldn't just abandon the Avengers. They might be in a real mess and need her help. Alright, go do your thing. Even though Hod was a little disappointed, he understood Wanda, and it probably had something to do with the situation in Germany, with Captain America siding with the Winter Soldier, who knew what was going to happen. Bucky was the only person who could make Steve throw away his judgment. Hey, can't you give me a hint about the surprise? Wanda asked, her curiosity piqued. She was dying to know what Hod had planned. It's a surprise. Hod said mysteriously, a smile playing on his lips. I'll tell you tonight at the manor. That he knew Wanda would be blown away when she saw Lorna again. TSK. Fine, keep your secrets. Wanda scoffed, crossing her arms with a playful air of disdain. She suspected Hod was just trying to get her back to the manor. The man was insatiable. Okay, go get busy. Hod ruffled her hair, putting Wanda's worries aside. He was able to relax. See you later. Wanda flew off the balcony and into the sky. Guess I should head back. Watching Wanda disappear, Hod stretched and headed downstairs. This was his beachfront villa, but it mostly just sat empty. The beach was pretty, but the sea breeze was sticky and the manor was comfier. Before leaving, he called Imelda and asked her to send someone to clean the place up. Since he didn't stay here often, he had someone come clean it every few days. Back at the manor, Hod stepped through the dimensional gate into the southwest corner of the yard. He unlocked the door with his fingerprint and was about to walk in when he felt a sudden sense of danger. He instinctively stepped to the right, raising his left hand. An iron bowl wrapped in green light landed in his hand. Looking up, he saw Lorna standing there, staring at him, shocked. Oh my gosh, Mr. Hodder, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hit you. Lorna said awkwardly, scratching the back of her head. I was just trying out my powers. When she'd been in the lab, she knew she had abilities, but she hadn't had many chances to practice. It's cool. Hod grinned, placing the bowl on a nearby table. But you're looking a lot better. That he noticed Lorna's cheeks were much rosier than they'd been yesterday. I haven't slept this well in ages. Thanks to Imelda, of course. Lorna said, her cheeks flushing as she stared at the ground. She was shy and didn't even dare to look at Hod. She hadn't slept in such a comfortable bed for ages. Glad you're liking it. Hod walked over and gently tousled Lorna's hair. He really liked this kid. She was a little introverted and shy, but sweet. Oh yeah, Mr. Hod, my name's Lorna. Lorna seemed to remember something and hurried to introduce herself. She'd fallen asleep in Hod's arms yesterday, so she forgot the most important thing. The only reason she knew Hod's name was because Imelda had told her. Okay, we're family now, no need to be so formal. Hod couldn't help smiling at Lorna's nervousness. So, what can you do? Hod remembered Lorna had been practicing her powers and was curious. He was also keen to know how much Lorna differed from the Polaris he remembered. I can control metal. Lorna answered quickly. But, it's only metal, not as if she would be scolded if she answered slowly. Metal control. Faced with Lorna's answer, Hod was surprised. Lorna didn't fully understand her own powers yet. It should be called magnetic field control, but because she was so young, she hadn't developed it fully. You can do more than that. Hod bent down slightly, speaking in a friendly tone. Just keep trying. This was the future Polaris. She just hadn't figured out her powers yet. Huh? Lorna looked confused, not really understanding what Hod meant. Give it another shot. I'll see if I can explain it better. Hod stood beside Lorna, ready to help her. Plus, he already had this power, so it would be easier to teach her. Okay. Lorna nodded, slowly raising her hands, gritting her teeth. The iron bowl lifted off the ground, as if controlled by an invisible hand, but that hand wasn't very strong, even floating. It looked like it could fall at any moment. Finally, Lorna gently lowered the floating bowl, looking exhausted. Phew! She looked expectantly at Hod, waiting for praise. Good job. Great work. Hod smiled, ruffling her hair. But, let's try something heavier, like that iron statue outside. Looking at Lorna's innocent face, he couldn't imagine that she was the unhinged Polaris to come, but he understood where it came from. With Polaris's family history of mental illness, it was usually fine, but when they experienced something traumatic, their minds would shift. Polaris actually had two personalities, which made her snap later. Lorna looked in the direction Hod was pointing, pursing her lips. That's too heavy. I can't lift it. She had already tried it, but at most she could only levitate it a bit. Not exactly impressive. Being able to levitate at all was pretty good, but precise control was beyond her, and there was no way she could move something that heavy. I believe in you. Give it a shot. Hod looked at Lorna encouragingly. Lorna's abilities were far more than that, and he knew she could do it, if she only had more faith. Really? Lorna met Hod's gaze, and a spark of confidence flickered in her eyes. If this kind man thought she could do it, then she must be able to. She wanted to believe in this man who made her feel so good. She was willing to trust him. Tilting her head, she focused and her right hand began to glow with a soft, strange green light. The light flowed in her hand, and the iron statue in the distance began to tremble. It's working. She gritted her teeth, and the heavy iron statue slowly lifted an inch. Even though it was only a little, Hod clearly saw it. Try harder, a little higher. Lorna strained with all her might. Bang! The statue crashed back to the ground, shaking the earth and sending dust flying. Even the eagle wings on it fluttered. I can't do it. Lorna frowned, panting, shaking her head. She was exhausted. This was her best effort, breaking her previous record. You've got a lot of potential. Hod reached out and gave her cheek a comforting squeeze. He knew how powerful Lorna could be, and she was barely tapping into it, but that was to be expected. She was only 16 or 17, it was impressive that she was doing this well, and he didn't want to push Lorna too hard. Strength was only meant to protect herself in the future. Thanks. Lorna's eyes flickered with disappointment. But the scientists at the lab said my powers won't get much stronger. She had been tested before, and they said even if she practiced, she could only be more precise, which wasn't even as good as a gun, so she had never considered becoming stronger. It was good enough to help out a little, no matter how much she wanted to. this was her limit. She figured Hod was just being nice. Who said that? Hod asked calmly. Your power is magnetic field control, one of the strongest abilities there is. Magnetic field control. Lorna stared, stunned. That was completely different from what she had imagined. She never thought her power was this magnetic field control. Yep. Hod didn't elaborate, but opened his hand slightly. He looked at the iron statue calmly, buzz buzz buzz, star. Lorna's eyes widened. Your powers, that she clearly felt that familiar power in Hod. Magnetic field control. And it was incredibly strong. If she was water in a bowl, Hod's power was an ocean. And the power wasn't visible, only the slight ripples in the air gave it away. She never expected Hod to know how to do this. Creak, star. Hod clenched his right hand and the statue began to warp and crumple, squeezed by something. The steel groaned under the pressure. It was crushed into a lump of iron. Whoa! Lorna gasped. She had never imagined that the power could be so strong. Magnetic field control is way more than just metal. Hod said calmly, feeling the power flowing through him. He had a fully developed magnetic field. Unlike Lorna, it wasn't as strong as Magneto in the comics, but was more than strong enough to match Magneto in the movies. You could even say that his control was stronger than Magneto's. More than just metal? Lorna asked, confused. Yep. Hod knew that explanations wouldn't help much, so he turned his palm downward. His arm trembled slightly, and a terrifying force burst out. The ground shook. The ground began to crack and split, dozens of fissures racing outwards. The ground roared, trees and grass collapsed. The clear sky grew dark, black clouds covered it, lightning flashed. The ground trembled, like a terrifying earthquake was happening. Oh my gosh! Lorna felt the power, tens of thousands of times stronger than hers. At the same time, at the local weather bureau, beep beep. Star. Report, something's happening. A staff member shouted, terrified. What's wrong? The officer asked. The Earth's crust near New York is moving. It's cracking apart. This could be a massive earthquake. Chapter 72. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The officer stared intently at the screen. The numbers made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, goosebumps erupted down his spine, and his pupils constricted. The screen showed an 8.0 magnitude earthquake. Evacuate everyone, now, that he shouted, frantically typing out a message on his computer. The quake had just struck, so there should be some time to get people out, and the epicenter was in New York. An 8.0 earthquake would be catastrophic. This kind of earthquake wasn't supposed to happen here. Chaos erupted at the Meteorological Bureau as everyone scrambled to get the word out. Sir, we've sounded the alarm. What's next? A staff member yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. Even with the alarm, the quake zone would reach New York City fast. At magnitude 8, at least 2/3 of the buildings in New York would crumble. What do you think? Tell the hospitals to evacuate and prep for mass casualties. The officer's face was ashen, his roar echoing around the room. He just hoped the shaking wouldn't last long. Maybe that would save some buildings. The hospitals needed to be ready first because medical resources would be stretched thin. Even though the quake was 40 or 50 miles from New York, the aftershocks would still register as a 7. If it spread further, the consequences were unthinkable, and New York was a coastal city. Tidal waves would send the death toll skyrocketing. Okay. I'm on it. The staff member scrambled back to his desk and started making calls. There wasn't much they could do but warn as many people as possible. He could already picture the devastation. Sirens wailed across New York. Passers-by noticed that everyone's cell phone buzzed at the same time. Their eyes widened, confusion etched on their faces. What's going on? Why the sudden alarm? Hey, I've got a message on my phone. Something must have happened. That alarm sounded urgent. Nah, what could happen? They pulled out their phones. The message filled them with dread. An earthquake was the last thing they expected. Even though the main shock hadn't hit yet, people in New York were already feeling a slight tremor. Ah! Earthquake! Run! I got a text. It's headed this way. We're doomed. An 8.0 earthquake. No time to escape. Even if I ran, there's nowhere to go with all these skyscrapers. Above the blaring alarms, the crowd stampeded downstairs. They ran faster than they ever had before. They'd felt a slight tremor even before the news broke. Even if the earthquake hadn't arrived, it was already making its presence felt. Down on the beach, a fisherman sat in his expensive chair, fiddling with his hook. He baited the hook and tossed it into the water. He was used to the bait being stolen. He watched the bobber. Suddenly, the ground began to shake. He frowned. Earthquake. He looked up. The water was receding rapidly. Even the fishing bobber lay on the exposed reef. What the heck? He stared at the receding water, lifting his sun hat. Then he saw the horizon. His fishing rod clattered onto the rocks. Giant waves, dozens of feet high, were surging toward the shore. He stared, dumbfounded. Shit. Shit. I'm gonna die. He abandoned his expensive gear and sprinted toward his car. That wave would kill him. Meanwhile, at Avengers HQ, bang. Tony slammed his hand on the table, glaring at Steve. Steve. Sam saw you let Bucky go. He paced back and forth, his anger barely contained. He couldn't believe Steve would do that. Steve took a deep breath and stood his ground. Bucky didn't do it on purpose. Someone's controlling him. He knew Bucky was innocent. He'd been set up. Bucky had told him he wasn't even there. So what? Tony gritted his teeth. Is that your excuse? That's why you didn't arrest him? He couldn't believe Steve would put his personal feelings above everything else. Calm down. Steve's voice was sharp. We need to find the real mastermind, not punish Bucky. He wouldn't let his friend take the fall. The only way to fix this was to catch the real culprit. The other guy was planning something big. Ha! Tony laughed bitterly, leaning on the table. How are we supposed to explain this to Wakanda and Ross? They needed to bring Bucky in for questioning, regardless of who was pulling the strings. Steve's actions were reckless and selfish. Ross and Wakanda were breathing down their necks. He could barely manage the pressure. Steve was only thinking about the immediate situation, not the big picture. We don't work for them. Why should we explain anything? Steve crossed his arms, glaring back at Tony. They were supposed to be independent, not puppets. Grow up. You're acting like a child. Tony's anger boiled over. Steve wasn't thinking ahead. They were independent, but they couldn't just ignore the authorities. Without any oversight, they'd be out of control. The other Avengers watched the argument in silence. Their expressions conflicted. Everyone had their own opinion. They didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. Wanda sat on a stool in the corner, her impatience growing. Finding Bucky was the top priority. Nothing could move forward until they found him. A crimson glow flickered around her hands. She was about to break up the fight. Suddenly, the building began to tremble. What was that? Steve widened his stance to stay steady. He hadn't felt an earthquake in years. Boss. Major earthquake detected. Magnetic field disruption. It's spreading toward the ocean. Friday's voice echoed through the room. Earthquake. Tony was stunned. Show me the data. If a major earthquake hit New York, the consequences would be dire. A blue holographic projection appeared instantly. 8.0 magnitude earthquake spreading rapidly toward the ocean. Current location, 4.6 magnitude. Aftershocks in New York City, 3.6 magnitude. Tony's eyes widened at the map. The earthquake was strange. It wasn't spreading in all directions, but straight toward the ocean. It was like it was deliberately avoiding New York. Only the weaker aftershocks were hitting the city. Otherwise, New York would already be in ruins. This earthquake was too bizarre. It defied logic. What's happening? Something's wrong with this quake. How can an earthquake's vibrations be controlled? And did you notice it seems to be avoiding populated areas? This is insane. What is going on? Everyone's faces were grim. The fact that the earthquake was in this area, the aftershocks were what came to New York. The shaking suddenly stopped. The whole thing lasted less than 10 seconds. They were all stunned. Even the slightest tremor had been terrifying. Only Wanda noticed something. the location of the quake was familiar. It was close to Hood's house. Could Hood be responsible? It was just a fleeting thought, it was impossible. This was an earthquake. The quake zone stretched for 40 or 50 miles, no one could control that kind of power. Inside the manor, the villa still stood, but everything around it had been transformed, the ground was ripped up, and many decorations were buried, the trees tilted, the ground undulated, everything had been torn from the earth, trees were sucked into the cracks, decorations were half buried. Is this real power? That the girl stared, speechless, swallowing hard. She'd never imagined possessing such immense power, the power of a natural disaster. In seconds, everything had been transformed. This power could destroy the world. She was sure Hood could obliterate an entire city, he could bury it underground, and it had only lasted a few seconds. Hood hadn't even broken a sweat, he acted like he'd done something trivial, barely even blinking. This is just the tip of the iceberg of magnetic field control. Hood waved his hand calmly, he knew he couldn't use this power again. He deliberately directed the force to avoid hitting New York. He wasn't a monster, but the power was frightening. He could even control the ocean and engulf the city. This was the power of the magnetic field. Using magnetism was the simplest form of manipulation. Luna didn't understand the full extent of it, because the power of steel was limited, but the magnetic field could change everything. That was what Luna needed to learn. That's insane, that the girl stammered. If she had that kind of power, no one could hurt her, the demons wouldn't stand a chance. She thought she was doomed, but Hood had opened a new door for her. The way he used magnetic fields defied logic. Her life had changed in that moment. Hood had no idea how powerful the girl would become. Don't underestimate yourself. You're powerful. Hood ruffled Lorna's hair, comforting her. A few words could change someone's life. The scientists didn't have this power. They didn't understand its potential. Calling it magnetism was a joke. Can I do that someday? Lorna tugged at Hood's sleeve, her eyes shining. She'd understood how he'd use the power, she'd be able to do it soon. Nope. Hood wagged his finger, his expression was serious. Huh? Lorna's face fell. She thought she was capable, but she was wrong. She had a lot to learn. Hood said, you can't use that kind of power carelessly. Unless I'm here, who's going to mow the lawn? Mow the lawn? Lorna frowned. Then she understood, it wasn't that she couldn't do it, but there'd be consequences. She looked at the chaos and pouted. It would cost a fortune to fix. The cracks were everywhere. Hood smiled and waved his hand. A dark red light rippled outward, the cracked ground seemed to rewind, everything reversed, the buried decorations reappearing, the light passed, the cracks closed, and the grass grew back. It was peaceful, like nothing had happened. Lorna stared at Hood in disbelief. He was mysterious and incredibly powerful. Chapter 73. You are listening at novelfull.audio. New York, the Bronx, in front of Empire State University, a sleek black Aston Martin DBX pulled up to the school gate. Behind the wheel, the driver sat ramrod straight, his eyes hidden. The rear door swung open, and a woman in a black dress stepped out, her pale legs flashing. She wore a brown trench coat, a chic little purse slung over her shoulder, and dark sunglasses. Hella stood outside Empire State University, a smile playing on her lips. She snapped her fingers. The Aston Martin DBX behind her seemed to jolt awake, looking around as if confused. Finally, Hella removed her sunglasses, her lips curving into a smile. She'd been focused on recovering her strength lately, and now, with more than half of it restored, she was hunting down the Phoenix Force. Those Midgardians were good at hiding things. After days of searching, she'd finally picked up a trace of the Phoenix Force right here. That familiar Phoenix aura. Hella stepped forward and strode towards the school. Men around her couldn't help but stare. This woman had an irresistible aura, like a dark abyss. Following the feeling, Hella entered the building, removing her sunglasses and slipping them into her purse. It's gotta be here. She could clearly sense the aura coming from a classroom upstairs. It was faint, but she knew it was the Phoenix Force. Gwen Stacy, a professor with round glasses was calling out names. Gwen Stacy, she called again. A girl with short blonde hair raised her hand, looking dazed. Here. Gwen, you don't seem like yourself. The professor looked at Gwen. This girl always stood out in class, always focused, but today, she looked out of it. Just then, Hella walked into the hallway, her gaze swept across the room, landing on Gwen. Gwen. So it's coming from you. Hella wasn't surprised to see Gwen. The Phoenix Force was so faint, more accurately, she was only touched by the Phoenix Force. What is certain is that this must have come into contact with the user of Phoenix Force. However, as long as the relationship between this person and the man that day is known, I am afraid that person will be found soon. All right. Richard Gerald, the professor nodded, satisfied, after calling out the last name on her list. Looks like most of the class was here today. She turned and noticed a woman standing at the door. Are you Miss Sally? That she paused, adjusted her glasses, and asked. Yeah, so, Hella, who had been watching Gwen, frowned at the professor's question. We've been waiting for you to sub. The teacher's out sick, so we were hoping you could fill in for a week. The professor sounded relieved. She'd been filling in herself, but the teacher had been gone for over a month. They'd asked someone from another school to sub, and she only knew the substitute's name. Substitute? Hella hesitated, then a smile bloomed on her face. That's right, I'm here to sub. This was her chance to get close to Gwen. She agreed instantly. Great. Here's the lesson plan. I'll leave you to it. The professor looked much happier. Finally, she could stop covering the class. She had her own classes to teach. After all, she handed Hella the lesson plan and hurried off. All right class, let's get started. Hella strode into the classroom in her heels, casually dropping the lesson plan on the desk. She eyed the students with heavy eyeliner. This teacher's kinda hot. Yeah, but that eyeliner's intense. You think she's into rock? Who knows? She's just a sub from another school. I heard she's got a lot of experience and taught some really smart kids. The students had heard of Ms. Sally. They'd imagined an old stick in the mud, not this trendy woman. Even with the heavy eyeliner, she was clearly a knockout. The boys perked up. A hot teacher. Who wouldn't want that? Lesson plan. Hella ignored the stares and whispers, flipping open the plan. The title read, In-depth analysis and path exploration of clean energy technology innovation and industry coordinated development to achieve sustainable energy system. What the hell is this? How could Hella, goddess of death, understand this Midgardian lesson? Frustrated, she tossed it in the trash. She wasn't in the mood to teach these people, and if she did, it would be a biology lesson. Congrats, you got me. Hella tilted her head, looking at the students with contempt. So, you can all just hang out here and study. Quietly. Huh. No lesson. I need to pass this class. We're supposed to be learning about energy. This is bogus. If you ain't gonna teach, leave. We can study by ourselves. The students were shocked. This was a good school, they were disciplined, they paid to be taught. Shut up. Hella looked disgusted at the chaos. Her roar silenced the room. An indescribable aura filled the space. The students gasped, feeling like they couldn't breathe. The pressure of the goddess of death spread through the classroom, and everyone stared at Hella, terrified. Ah, peace and quiet. Hella smiled, clapping her hands. Turns out she was a natural teacher. Now everyone would be quiet. Hello? A voice spoke from the door. Hella turned to see a woman in her 50s, holding a book. She looked at the students as if she was thinking about something. To read the novel, go to Falun Novel Network. Hella realized this must be the real substitute teacher. A faint green light flashed in her eyes. Sorry, never mind. The real Ms. Sally shook her head, looking broken, and turned away. Hella found a stool, crossed her legs, and watched the students. Her eyes often met Gwen's, but Gwen was out of it. She was just glad there was no class today. Her head was filled with thoughts of Hood and Wanda. She couldn't focus on anything. Ding, 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 the bell rang, and noisy footsteps sounded outside. Gwen sighed in relief. Finally. She stood up, ready to head home, but someone blocked her way. Hella stood there. Gwen, can you show me around the campus? Huh? Me? Gwen was confused. This cool substitute teacher wanted her to show her around. Late that night, Hood drove a black Cayenne to the door of a luxury hotel. he was wearing a black suit for the first time in a long time. He stepped out of the car, handing $1 and the keys to the valet. He walked around to the back door, opened it, and extended his hand to help a girl in a dark green evening gown. The girl's hair was up, and though she tried to look calm, she couldn't help but glance around. He was planning to find Wanda, but Wanda has been too busy lately, plus, he was attending the Stark Group's shareholder banquet tonight. It was an extremely grand banquet. He hadn't planned to go, but Tony kept calling. He agreed, and decided to take Lorna with him. Since he showed his strength to Lorna, she seemed to have some awe of her. Even when talking, her eyes were a little evasive, and she didn't even dare to come over and talk to him. When they saw each other, she just said hello, but she also worked harder in practicing her skills, basically practicing non-stop at home. It was also because she took into account that Lorna had spent the past few years in a cage, so her character was so cautious. She simply brought Lorna to the dinner, and also accompanied her to take a good look at the outside world. As soon as Lorna emerged, reporters on both sides of the hotel started snapping photos. This was a Stark Group event. After all, the people here were top dogs. Most of the rich and powerful people in New York could be found here, and wealthy folks from out of town. No one wanted to miss the opportunity to rub elbows with the Stark Group. An invite was a golden ticket. Flashes popped, momentarily blinding Lorna. Her heart raced. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked inside with Hood, afraid of embarrassing him. No interviews, please. Hood was used to reporters. He shook his head, politely refusing, and led Lorna into the hotel. Hood, you made it. Tony greeted them, throwing his arms around Hood. Hood suddenly became the center of attention. No one expected Tony to be so friendly with an unknown guy. Tony, you look beat. Hood guided Lorna and Tony to a table before asking. Tony looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot and surrounded by dark circles. Been a rough few days. Tony grabbed a glass of brandy from a passing waiter and downed it. He was exhausted. What's up? Wanna talk about it? Hood wondered what the situation was now without the split. Steve's protecting a criminal. Tony ground his teeth, his eyes flashing. A damn criminal. Just thinking of Bucky made him furious. The recent earthquake gave him a headache. The earthquake that occurred yesterday was too strange. These things were overwhelming him. Maybe he has a reason. Hood understood the basics of the situation. Yeah, well. Tony shook his head, sighing. It's just. Steve and I can't seem to agree on anything anymore. Hood patted Tony on the shoulder. I'm here if you need anything. Thanks, man. Tony shook his head. But you know, the Avengers stuff is never simple. Hood was just a businessman. What could he do? Boom. The ceiling exploded, steel and debris rained down, dust and smoke filled the air, and the heat from the explosion blasted through the room. Ah! Guests screamed. Everyone scrambled for safety. The ceiling crashed down on Hood and Tony. They were right in the middle. Watch out! Tony reacted and tried to dive out of the way, but without his armor, he was helpless against the falling debris. Buzz. Suddenly, a wave of energy washed over them. Tony stared, wide-eyed. Was that magic? Chapter 74. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Buzz. A low hum and a green light erupted, forming a dark green, semicircular barrier. The barrier scooped up all the fallen stones and boulders, flinging them out the window. The sudden display brought a collective sigh of relief. I thought I was a goner. What the hell just happened? Why the explosion? Was that a terrorist attack? What saved our bacon? Shaken, everyone's legs turned to jelly, and they slumped to the ground. It was so intense, they were sure the hotel was coming down. Holy crap. Tony gasped, still rattled. He actually thought Iron Man might bite the dust in some two-bit hotel. His eyes then locked on a girl behind him, her dark green hair practically glowing with green light radiating from her hands. You okay? Hood rushed forward, supporting a drained Lorna. He was about to jump into action, but Lorna's reaction was lightning fast. She must have been pushing herself to the absolute limit. She blocked all those rocks and chucked them out in one go. I'm fine. Lorna's face was white as a sheet, her legs wobbly. She leaned heavily into Hood's arms, even her voice was weak. With Hood's support, the green glow faded from her hand. Tony. Happy barreled in with a bunch of security guards, surrounding Tony. He scanned the guests with a grim expression, ready to draw his weapon at the first sign of trouble. After confirming Tony was okay, Happy barked orders. Team 1 and 2, search upstairs and figure out what caused this. Teams 3 and 4, question everyone here, that this was a planned terrorist attack, no question about it. They somehow bypassed security and planted explosives. Sirens wailed as police cars descended on the hotel, cordoning off the area. In the hotel lounge. I am so sorry this happened. Tony, sitting on the sofa, ran a hand through his hair, apologizing. Even if he made it out unscathed, this would be a nightmare for the other guests. These were A-listers, they were probably freaked out. Dealing with the fallout would be a pain. It's fine, as long as no one got hurt. Hood waved it off. He walked over and poured a glass of water, handing it to Lorna, who was leaning back on the sofa. She might be beat, but the situation gave her major control gains. Besides, even without Lorna, these people wouldn't have been hurt. Tony glanced at Lorna, recalling the event. If it weren't for her, things would have been ugly. He wondered about her powers but quickly dropped it. She was with Hood, and frankly, he had other things on his mind, like figuring out who was behind this. Just thinking about it got him riled up. Happy's team was searching, but they weren't finding much. He had to check the surveillance tapes. Thanks. Lorna sipped the water. Her mental exhaustion was fading. It was just overusing her ability, no permanent damage. So, Tony, who do you think is behind this? Hood asked while tending to Lorna. Well. Tony hesitated. He had his suspicions, but he wasn't sure if he should tell Hood. Hood wasn't an Avenger. If he spoke freely, Hood could be in danger. Bang. The lounge door burst open. A crimson figure rushed in, eyes wide. When she saw Hood next to a girl, she breathed a sigh of relief. She raced over after hearing about the explosion. Tony. Steve and the others rushed in, looking worried. Nobody thought anyone would attack Tony at a celebrity party. Hood, I'll get to the bottom of this. Take Lorna back and get some rest. Tony looked at the team and addressed Hood. This was an internal meeting, and it wouldn't be right for Hood to hang around. Besides, he was holding back information. Okay. Hood nodded. He didn't want to stick around. He sensed Tony's turbulent emotions. Tony knew the truth but wasn't saying it. This was bigger than it seemed. Besides, Hood wanted no part of it. This was Avengers business, and his gut told him the Winter Soldier, Bucky, was involved. Let's go, Lorna. Hood helped Lorna up, walking towards the door. That's when Wanda noticed the girl next to Hood. Did he find me a sister? Wanda's eyes widened, glaring at Hood. Just wait, I'll get you later. Hood helped Lorna past Wanda, shrugging. Surprise. Surprise? Is that all it is? Wanda was about to blow. 2 wasn't enough. Now 3. He's got a libido, but this is ridiculous. With the team present, Wanda bit her tongue. Let's see who this is. Wanda eyed the dark-haired girl. She felt a strange, familiar feeling, and her heartbeat slowed. She'd met her before. Watching Hood support the girl away, Wanda spun around. I'll escort Mr. Hood out. Everyone looked at her. Okay, thanks. Tony nodded. Danger was recent. It would be great if Wanda could see her friend out. She took off. The moment the door closed, Tony's face hardened, his eyes cold. He glared at Steve. Say what's on your mind. Steve sat across from him, placing his shield on the table. He felt Tony's animosity. Tony's hand rested on his watch. The watch could turn into a gauntlet. Steve, don't tell me you know nothing. Tony eyed Steve, ready to pounce. Steve had to know. He just wasn't talking. What do I know? Steve said through gritted teeth. You think I planned this? What did Tony mean? Why would he kill Tony? You think everyone's the culprit. We're teammates. Sam frowned. He trusted Steve. He wouldn't hurt his friends. Tony, I think everyone is the murderer, and we're all teammates. Sam frowned. He trusted Steve. He wouldn't turn on his friends. Tony looked at everyone quietly. Bucky planned this. Silence. Nobody thought Tony would jump to that conclusion. they finally understood Tony's wariness of Steve. Steve let Bucky go last time. "Tony, do you have any proof?" Steve said grimly. Bucky would never do this. They were jumping to conclusions. Bucky was being framed. "Huh, proof? I'll give you proof," Tony sneered, pulling a piece of black material from his briefcase and slamming it on the table. "What's this?" Steve frowned. "This is the explosive Happy found upstairs, the same used to kill the king of Wakanda," Tony said, his voice icy. He knew this material. He could identify it without testing. This explosive left a charred black residue, the color drained from everyone's face. "Impossible," Steve stood, agitated. "Bucky's not in the States, he can't enter the country." Bucky wasn't here, he had no motive, this was a smear job. "I didn't expect our captain to protect the enemy." Tony leaned back, watching Captain America. "You're pinning the blame on others." Steve grabbed his shield, striding toward the door. He couldn't reason with Tony. Tony saw him as an enemy. He slammed the door, leaving without another word. The others watched helplessly. "I'll investigate this myself." Tony's eyes were cold. He showed no remorse. Natasha watched everything from a stool, her face expressing helplessness. Hood was about to help Lorna into the back seat. A crimson figure appeared. Wanda pushed Hood into the seat, her teeth clenched. Lorna stared blankly, unsure of what to do. "This is the surprise?" Wanda pointed at Lorna, growling. The surprise was another girl. "Yeah." Hood nodded, smirking. "Don't you like it?" "Damn you. Are you always horny?" Wanda pinched his side, eyes blazing. How could she like it? Sharing with two was too much. Now there was another one. She couldn't imagine how many women Hood would have. "All right, stop it." Hood pulled Wanda closer. "Get in, Lorna." Lorna glanced at Wanda and slowly stepped up. She could tell Wanda and Hood were close. Wanda glared. "Are you a beast? This girl's not even fully developed." She was too skinny, and her chest was flat. Lorna looked down, confused. Hood patted Wanda's head. "You're thinking too much." "Me? You're the one." Wanda was enraged. "Don't you think she looks familiar?" Hood kissed Wanda. "She's your sister." Wanda's head buzzed. "My sister?" Lorna widened her eyes. "Try chaos magic." Hood shrugged. Wanda hesitantly raised her hand, and a scarlet light appeared. A familiar, close feeling came over her. Even Lorna's eyes widened. "Right." Hood hugged Wanda. "How will you repay me?" "My sister's here." Wanda blushed. Hood smiled. "Even more exciting." Chapter 75. You are listening at novelfull.audio. But Hood let Wanda go, since the witch still had a job to finish. The next day, Hood shuffled downstairs in his slippers. He was still half asleep, his steps a little wobbly. Lazy days were his favorite. He found Lorna in cute pajamas, setting out breakfast. "What's with the breakfast duty?" Hood asked, surprised. "Imelda usually handled that." Lorna blushed, stammering. "I wanted to make you breakfast, to thank you for bringing me back and helping me find my sister." "You're welcome. I'm ready for Lorna's cooking." Hood pulled out a chair, but his smile froze when he actually looked at the food. The sandwich on the plate, well, it was pretty burnt. The egg in the middle looked suspect, charred actually, and was that salt sprinkled on it? The burnt spot suggested a blowtorch situation gone wrong. It should have been sugar. "What's wrong? Did I mess it up?" Lorna looked worried. No. I'm just touched you'd make me breakfast." Hood's eyes might have watered a little. He hadn't felt this bad in ages. What was this devil food? If he didn't know better, he'd think Lorna was trying to off him for the inheritance. He took a deep breath, grabbed the sandwich, and shoved it in his mouth. A bizarre mix of sour, sweet, bitter, spicy, and salty flavors exploded on his tongue, but Lorna was looking at him with such bright, hopeful eyes that he swallowed it all down. "If you liked it, Mr. Hood, I can make it any time." Lorna whispered, blushing. Seeing Hood finish her masterpiece made her really happy. "No way." Hood stood up, looking serious. "What's wrong?" Lorna asked nervously, was it really that bad? Or was Mr. Hood just trying to spare her feelings? Imelda's our maid. If you do her job, we'll have to fire her. Hood said, staring her down. Do you want that? That he wasn't keen on having his taste buds assaulted every morning. Oh, no, not at all. Lorna shook her head, thinking of Imelda's friendly face. Looks like breakfast duty was out. She didn't want to get Imelda canned. Buzz, Hood felt his phone vibrate. It was a text from Gwen, and get this, Gwen was inviting him out. What's up with this kid? Hood muttered. He'd planned to talk to Gwen today, but he hadn't expected her to reach out first. Out in the suburbs, golden maple trees swayed in the breeze, scattering leaves onto the grass. It was quiet and peaceful. Hood checked his phone's location inside. Little Gwen's into fall outings, This was the spot Gwen had chosen. He found a secluded spot and saw a figure in a white hoodie. Gwen, he raised a hand to wave, but his smile turned grim. He saw a tall, unwelcome figure, grinning. It was Hela, the goddess of death, who had been MIA for days. He never expected to see her here. With Gwen, a wave of murderous intent washed over him. He didn't know what was going on, but if she hurt Gwen, he'd show Hela what real death looked like. Hood. Gwen saw him and ran over. You okay? Hood asked quietly. Hello. Hela strolled over, giving Hood a loaded look. He could feel her energy swirling. Hood, this is my substitute teacher, Miss Sally. Gwen said, pulling Hela forward. Miss Sally? Hood sneered. When did the great Hela change her name? That if she was a sub, pigs would fly, and he didn't trust her motives for a second. Relax, I'm not going to hurt a kid. Hela gave a fake smile, hands raised in mock surrender. So what do you want? Hood pulled Gwen behind him, on guard. He was powerful, but he was worried about Gwen. He didn't know what Hela was capable of. What do I want? You know exactly what I want. Hela looked up at the sky, spreading her arms wide. I want to invite you to join me and conquer the universe. That with the Phoenix Force at her side, conquering the universe would be a snap, and in her opinion, Earth was just holding Hood back. Hiding on this dumpy planet with that kind of power was a waste. Women. Money. Power. She could give him all of that, and he could rule countless civilizations. That was way better than some podunk Earth life. I'm not interested. Hood frowned. Besides, you can't even beat a Midgardian. How are you going to conquer the universe? That if he wanted to conquer the universe, he wouldn't need her help. He had the system. That was the most terrifying power in the universe, and he'd have to be crazy to join a mentally unstable woman like Hela. Conquering the universe. More like conquering the loony bin. I just broke out of that cage last time. And I wasn't at full strength. I'd crush you now. Hela said. She'd taken a beating before, but that was because she wasn't fully powered up. The guy had the Phoenix Force, but he didn't know how to control it. She, on the other hand, did. So this time, Hood wouldn't stand a chance. She was gonna teach him a lesson and show him who he should be loyal to. You want another beatdown? Hood sighed. Was she serious? She'd come all this way just for a rematch. Unbelievable, but her confidence made him uneasy. He could suppress her, but he didn't want to waste the time. He hated trouble. You won't know until you try. Hela put her hands behind her head and brought them forward. Her hair rose into a spiky helmet, her clothes shifted into a tight combat suit. She grinned, her eyes lighting up. I don't have time for this. Let's make a bet. Hood shook his head. If he didn't do something, she'd keep coming back, and who knew if she'd target his friends. Better to end it now, so he wouldn't have to worry. A bet? Hela laughed. Interesting, Midgardian. What are the stakes? That she was enjoying this. It was the first time anyone had wanted to bet with her. I'll let you hit me 3 times. If you can hurt me, I'll go with you and conquer the universe. To read the exciting novel, go to Falun Novel Network. Hood laid it out. Beating Hela was pointless. He didn't want to deal with her crazy antics. Deal. Hela nodded instantly. Easy money. Hood held out his left hand, a rune forming in the air. This is a loyalty contract. If you lose, you have to help me. Hela's smile vanished, the goddess of death, helping someone else. Chicken. Hood taunted. Hela hesitated, then gritted her teeth. Fine. This was a sure thing. He couldn't block her attacks, even Odin wouldn't stand still for 3 hits. Gwen, who had been listening, turned pale, even she knew this substitute teacher was Hood's enemy. I'm sorry, Gwen said, looking at Hood with regret, she hadn't seen this coming. It's okay. She just wants to stretch my muscles. Hood smiled and ruffled her hair. It's just the goddess of death, Hela. Let's find a quieter place, Hood said, heading toward a secluded area. They didn't need an audience. Come on, he told Gwen to stay back, then cracked his knuckles, grinning. The dark red phoenix force swirled around him, forming a barrier. I hope I don't kill you, Hela said, her eyes flashing. He was a nobody, but she still knew to take him seriously. He was strong. Ha, she roared, hands raised like talons, dark green energy crackling, crack, 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 star. The nearby mountainside exploded as if a monster was bursting from the earth. The mountain itself was lifted into the air by Hela. It hovered, a terrifying rock dragon, and smashed toward Hood. People in the area saw the spectacle. Monster. The mountain's flying. Run. Leave your stuff, just get out of here. Everyone screamed and ran, even from a distance. The scene was horrifying. Hood. Gwen's heart leaped into her throat. Why had she brought this person here? The power was insane. She could lift a mountain. Hood stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the falling mountain. He didn't move. Rumble. Star. The mountain crashed down, burying Hood with immense force. Ha! Hela exhaled. Lifting that mountain had taken it out of her. The kid was buried. Done for. Crack. Star. A crack appeared in the mountain. Dark red energy surged out, splitting the mountain in 2. Hood emerged, hands still in his pockets, grinning. Nah, that barely warmed me up. Gwen sighed with relief. You asked for it. Hela couldn't believe it. He'd blocked it. She summoned 2 sharp blades, green energy intensifying between them. This was on a whole other level than before. This was a move she rarely used. It took too long to charge. She thrust her hands forward, the green energy shooting out like a sword. She focused all her power into a single point. Whoosh, star. The blast hit the Phoenix Force barrier. The surrounding woods were obliterated, but the barrier didn't budge. How is this possible? Hela was shocked. You made me do this. Hela's eyes flashed. The sky went dark. Black mist erupted from the ground, turning the area into hell. Black ghosts crawled out of the mist. The souls of the dead. What's that? Gwen shivered. The black gas rose, swallowing the forest. People fleeing nearby saw the swirling mist. Die. Hela was furious. Hood had humiliated the goddess of death. She'd use her signature move to show him the true power gap. Funny, I know that trick, too. Hood snapped his fingers. The ghosts turned and attacked Hela. What the? Hela was stunned. She, the goddess of death, was being attacked by her own ghosts. She backed away, terrified. Then, the ghosts swarmed her. Bang, star. Hood snapped his fingers again. Whoosh, star. The ghosts vanished. Hela knelt on the ground, shaking, muttering, impossible. Thud, star. Hood walked over, holding out the loyalty mark. You want to do this yourself, or should I? Hela gritted her teeth. It'll take me a while. Chapter 76. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Asgard, realm of the gods. Father, why have you summoned me? A powerfully built man with a beard, light golden hair, and gleaming armor strode into the hall. His every movement radiated a raw, untamed energy, and even his voice reverberated through the vast space. He'd been on the verge of crushing the fire giant when his father's summons yanked him back. Thor, I have a task for you. The god King Odin sat on his throne, his expression severe and imposing, his voice laced with a hint of unease. A shadow seemed to darken Odin's face. Just say the word, Father. I'm your guy. Thor thumped his chest, his steel armor ringing like a bell, his whole demeanor was bursting with confidence. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what could be so urgent that his father pulled him away from taking down the fire giant. You have a sister, Thor, sealed away in Midgard, in Norway, long ago. As Odin spoke, a complex mix of emotions flickered in his aged eyes. He felt conflicted about this daughter. A sister. Thor was floored, like a lightning bolt had just struck him. He'd never suspected such a thing, and Odin had never breathed a word of it. Worse, she was sealed on Midgard, which meant Odin himself had ordered it. Why would his father be so ruthless toward his own daughter? Yes. Odin nodded slowly. She committed a great wrong, and so she was imprisoned. She should have remained so, but she escaped before her time. He knew Hela's nature all too well. If she roamed free, a bloodbath was sure to follow. He had to find a way to resolve this before she unleashed chaos. So, you want me to? Thor looked puzzled, curiosity battling with reluctance, but seeing the grim set of Odin's face, he held back his questions. If his father wanted to tell him, he would have already. I need you to track her down, find Hela. Odin took a deep breath, laying out his plan in a somber tone. Hela could not be allowed to run loose, and of all his warriors, Thor was the most suited for the task. He may not be as strong as Hela, but finding her wouldn't be too hard compared to actually fighting her. All right, father, you got it, Thor agreed casually, already envisioning bringing back this sister he'd never known. This was no problem. Besides, he was also curious about her. What could she have done to warrant being sealed away by Odin? Wait, just as Thor turned to leave, Odin's voice stopped him. Thor faced his father, a question in his eyes. Be careful. Hela wields immense power. Even if you find her, don't engage her yourself. Inform me immediately. Odin's expression was grave. Thor was headstrong. If he tangled with Hela, he wouldn't stand a chance. Only Odin himself could contain her and reimpose the seal. Okay, father, Thor nodded, but without taking it to heart, then strode out. He shrugged off Odin's caution. She might be his sister, but how strong could she really be? He was Thor, the god of thunder. Few could stand against him. Odin watched the reckless figure depart, then lowered his head with a sigh, his face etched with worry. This was far from a simple matter. He knew Hela could never have broken free on her own. Even if the seal was unstable due to his own dwindling power, it was still unbreakable. But a surge of energy appeared and directly caused Hela to break the seal and escape. Who possessed such power? And what were their motives? The uncertainty gnawed at him. He didn't even know when such a being had appeared on Midgard. Everything felt so unsettling. He could only pray that Hela's capture went smoothly. Earth, New York suburbs. The scene was one of total devastation. Trees were uprooted, as if battered by a monstrous hurricane. The green grass had vanished, replaced by a barren expanse of sand like the Gobi Desert. Most baffling of all, a mountain had disappeared without a trace, then reappeared in a completely different spot. As if it had been lifted and set down again, a miracle of destruction. Police swarmed the area, cordoning off a perimeter miles wide. Most of New York's finest were on the scene. Oh my God, what happened here? The Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff, surveyed the chaos, her jaw hanging open. The mountain alone was enough to make her blood run cold. She'd witnessed the mysterious man's power before, but this was on another level. The sheer scale defied belief. How could this even be possible? Even Stark Industries' biggest mining trucks couldn't move that much rock in a day. They'd been called in to investigate a massive explosion. Some claimed to have seen the mountain flying, but they dismissed it as a hallucination. Now, faced with this outlandish scene, they knew something truly strange had happened. This was more than an explosion. Damn it, the Winter Soldier was enough of a headache, and now this kind of weirdness is happening in New York. War Machine, James Rhodey Rhodes, couldn't find a place to begin complaining as he stared at the scene. Not to mention Tony and Steve were at each other's throats lately. It felt like every time they met it was a spark waiting for a fire, and these odd events kept popping up near New York. Chaotic magnetic fields and energy bursts. Anyone would think the world was ending. He was constantly chasing down these leads, only to hit dead ends. Something about this. Natasha's eyes narrowed as she noticed something out of place. She knelt and carefully examined the traces on the ground, a frown creasing her brow, a fine black powder covered the area. Too fine, at first glance, it could be mistaken for pulverized black rock, but the texture suggested it had been ground down past the point of sand and gravel. The more she looked, the more familiar it felt. Where have I seen this before? I know I recognize it. Natasha gritted her teeth, racking her memory, then, her eyes widened. Gwilyn Beach. Could this be the work of the mysterious man? Or were all these recent anomalies his doing? What is it? See something? Rhodey, noticing Natasha's serious expression, realized she'd found something significant. I think this might be. Natasha was about to voice her suspicion when, boom, a beam of rainbow light shot down from the sky. The blinding light forced everyone to shield their eyes. Then, a figure emerged from the dazzling column. Judging by the bulky frame, it had to be Thor. Natasha and Rhodey exchanged surprised glances. What was he doing here, instead of hanging out in Asgard? Long time no see, friends. Thor opened his arms wide, embracing Rhodey with a hearty, boisterous hug. What brings you here? Natasha asked cautiously. Thor never showed up without a reason. Oh, it's a long story. My sister, Hela, has gone missing. Thor didn't bother to hide it, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Missing? Natasha and Rhodey sensed trouble. The last time someone was missing, Loki nearly leveled New York. If a sister was missing, would the city be vaporized? These Asgardians were a handful. This gave them both a headache. Well, missing might not be the right word, but it's close enough. Thor shrugged nonchalantly. He didn't believe his sister could cause much real trouble. So, where are you now? Rhodey asked, a perplexed look on his face. If Thor was looking for his sister, why was he here? I sensed Hela's energy signature here. I came through the Rainbow Bridge. After all, the energy was so immense that it was impossible to miss. Wait, you're saying your sister's energy vanished here? Natasha's surprise was palpable. This was the same place she had seen the mysterious man. Yes, judging by the devastation, it was probably my sister who did it. Thor took in the scene and sighed ruefully. This was big. But don't worry, we in the God realm will take responsibility for all this. This isn't just about responsibility anymore. Natasha felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The earth was already in a state, and now they had a God's realm mess on top of it. Even worse, the mysterious man seemed to have clashed with Thor's sister. Judging by the inhuman scale of the aftermath, it must have been one hell of a fight. Buzz. Rhodey's Bluetooth headset beeped. His expression turned grim as he answered the call. What is it? Natasha saw Rhodey's face and braced herself for bad news. Please don't tell her there was more trouble brewing before they even dealt with this. Steve took Sam and some others to Germany. Rhodey hung up the phone, his jaw tight. He had no idea what was going on, but he suspected it had something to do with Bucky, the Winter Soldier. What about Tony? Natasha didn't need to ask. She knew Tony would be furious when he heard this. Tony's going after him now. Rhodey sighed, his face strained. Tony had been on edge lately. Who knew what he would do with this news? Tony's going to blow a gasket. Natasha shook her head. Let's just hope there aren't any unnecessary conflicts. The tension between them had been simmering for too long. If a fight broke out, the consequences could be catastrophic. What's all this about? What's going on? What happened? Thor stroked his beard, surveying the wreckage caused by his sister. Noticing the grave faces, he strolled over, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. No time to explain, Rhodey said, needing to leave for Germany. Fine, we can talk on the way. Thor didn't seem to mind, hurrying to catch up with the two, on the plane. What? Are you breaking up, then? Thor bolted upright, shaking the cabin. He stared at Tony in disbelief, his eyes wide. Thor, breaking up, describes the end of a romantic relationship. Rhodey gave Thor a withering look. He started to explain, then shook his head slightly. Oh. Thor's mouth twitched, then he said awkwardly. Well, it's kinda the same thing. Shut up, Tony snapped at Thor, his nerves frayed. He was in a foul mood. He couldn't believe Steve would just run off with his men. Tony, where are we headed? Thor scratched his head, seemingly unaffected by Tony's outburst. Ross gave the order to take down the Winter Soldier, and Steve went rogue. He's helping him escape. Tony gritted his teeth, his voice barely a whisper. He was trembling with rage. He never thought Steve was capable of something like this. To protect one person, he'd betray everything. Tony, violence won't solve anything, right? Natasha spoke carefully, her brow furrowed. She didn't want to see her friends turn on each other. It was unthinkable, and it wasn't just Steve involved. Sam, Ant-Man, Hawkeye, and others were involved. Once the fighting started, there would be no going back. She wanted them to sit down and work things out. Natasha, Tony whirled around, his voice laced with fury. Whose side are you on? He paused and walked to the corner. There sat a noble young man with black skin. Tony said, "This is T'Challa, the Black Panther. I'm here to avenge my father." Black Panther T'Challa's eyes burned with anger. Bucky killed him with a bomb. My father just wanted peace. The cabin fell silent, heavy with discomfort. Even the ever-cheerful Thor fell silent. Wanda, sitting quietly in her seat, just watched the scene. Her face was etched with grief. Both sides were her friends, and she couldn't take sides. She didn't want to help, but she couldn't stay out of it. After hesitating for a long time, a mobile phone appeared in her hand. WandaHod, I'm in trouble. I hope you can help me. Chapter 77. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ugh. Inside the mansion, a guy was sprawled out on a lawn chair. It was autumn, and there was a nip in the air. The bright sun beat down, warming him up nicely. Now this is living. Hodder reached for his glass of red wine and took a sip. A pack of smoke sat on the table next to him. Buzz. Who's blowing up my phone? Hodder frowned at the vibration. Barely anyone had his number, and even fewer people texted him. He picked up the phone and saw a message from Wanda. WandaHod, I need your help. Tony and Steve are at each other's throats, and it's about to get physical. You're the only one who can stop them. Here we go, Hod thought. He remembered the fight from Avengers 3, it was team against team, and if Natasha hadn't flipped, things would have been a lot worse. Wanda would try to defuse the situation, but with Tony's attitude, no one could talk him down. He sighed, already getting a headache. Alright, if the little witch needs me, I'm on it. After all, this was the first time Wanda had asked him for a favor. He couldn't just blow her off. Hela. Hodder got up and headed inside to change. Hela stood by the gate, looking pissed. Hearing him, she turned and said, what? Ever since she'd come back, Hod had stuck her on gate duty. She'd been standing there all day. She was beyond annoyed. When had the goddess of death ever been treated like this? But she didn't have a choice. She was stuck with that loyalty brand. You're coming with me. Hod still planned to bring Hela along. He couldn't just leave his new recruit guarding the door. Besides, Hela was seriously powerful, and it was good to have her around to handle stuff. Yes. Hela grinned ear to ear. She was finally off gate duty. How could she not be happy? Mr. Hodder, can I come too? Lorna came clattering down the stairs in her slippers. She wanted to get out of the house, but didn't want to go alone. Hearing Hodder was leaving, she jumped at the chance to tag along. I'm dealing with some serious stuff. You should stay here and watch the place. Hod ruffled Lorna's green hair, sounding a little helpless. He could protect Lorna, but this wasn't a pleasure trip. She was better off at home. Okay. Lorna looked bummed, but nodded. Meanwhile, at a German airport, a large SUV was barreling down the runway. Steve drove, tight-lipped and serious. Falcon Sam, in the passenger seat, glanced at Steve, a mix of emotions on his face. He knew exactly what was happening, and knew Tony would blow a gasket. That arm of yours is sweet. Where did you get it? I gotta get one of those, or maybe I'll get one just like it tonight. Does that metal arm have any special features? A young guy in the back seat kept yammering, staring at Bucky's metal arm. Bucky, sitting behind the passenger seat, snapped, Shut up, Scott. You're Ant-Man, not a chatterbox. He couldn't understand why the guy hadn't shut up since he got in the car. It was like he had Tourette's. Even when he ignored him, he wouldn't quit. If he had to listen to Scott's blabbering, he would lose his mind. "Easy, Bucky." Scott put his hands up and said, "Respect, man, respect." That he just wanted to know where the metal arm came from. Why was he getting so worked up? "I'll show you respect when you duct tape your mouth shut," Bucky snarled, shooting Ant-Man a death glare. He couldn't believe he hadn't brought earplugs, and this was an emergency. Who knew what was going to happen, and this guy still had the energy to make small talk. "Can't duct tape my mouth." Scott shook his head, looking serious. Before he could say more, Steve chimed in, "All right, both of you, pipe down." Steve's attention was glued to his surroundings. He knew Tony wouldn't let this go. And he'd be coming, guns blazing. He just wanted to get Bucky to their destination. Once they found who framed Bucky, his name would be cleared. He didn't want his friend to live with this hanging over him. Steve drove deeper into the airport. Suddenly, a red blur crashed down onto the runway, blocking their path. It was a gold and red suit of armor. The helmet opened, revealing Tony Stark. At the same time, a few other figures emerged from the shadows. Black Panther T'Challa stepped forward, Hawkeye Barton joined Tony, War Machine Rhodes, suited up, and Vision floated down, looking grim. Black Widow and Thor came out of a nearby container, and then there was Wanda, looking conflicted. "Didn't think you'd actually show," Steve said. Steve's eyes flashed with disappointment, but mostly resolve. He stopped the car. Everyone got out. He refused to let his friend be dragged back like this. Everyone was there to stop him, but he knew he was doing the right thing. He'd rather trust his gut than listen to Ross. The Avengers, once a team, were now divided. "Steve, where did you dig up this punk?" Tony pointed at Scott, looking annoyed. This guy's been in the can for years. He hoped Steve would do the smart thing and hand over Bucky, then the Avengers could get back to being a team. "I'm no punk." Scott grinned, stretched a bit, and said, "But yeah, I did do some time." "Do you really have to do this? You guys are, like, super close." Thor scratched his head, forcing a smile. "I don't think this is necessary." He was standing there, but didn't know what to do. He was carefree, but that didn't mean he jumped to conclusions. They should all sit down and talk this out. And Bucky? They could just ask him what happened, but no one said anything. He awkwardly looked away, whistling like he didn't care. "Tony, I'm not gonna beat around the bush. Get out of my way." Steve knew this wouldn't end well. If Tony wanted a fight, they would give him one. "Steve, I don't want to see you make the same mistakes. Just give us Bucky." Tony, who had been smiling, now looked dead serious. T'Challa lost his father because of Bucky. He'd made up his mind. There was no way he was backing down. Mistake after mistake. "What if the truth isn't what you think?" Steve said. "I just need some time." He glanced at Bucky, his eyes full of resolve. No matter what, he would never let Tony take Bucky without knowing the truth. He'd already asked Bucky, and he knew he didn't do it. There'd been an accident, sure, but it was because Bucky was being controlled. As soon as they found Zemo, everything would be clear. "Time." "Huh." Tony sneered, his eyes turning cold. "You just want to hide Bucky." He refused to believe Steve. "Do we really have to do this?" Steve tightened his grip on his shield and stepped forward. He was ready to fight his way out. The most important thing was to get the Winter Soldier away from here. "Sam, don't go down with Steve. You're making the same mistake." Tony couldn't reason with Steve, so he tried with Sam. He wanted his fellow Avengers to see things from his side. They were betraying him, taking Bucky without permission. "I believe him." Sam didn't know if he was doing the right thing, but he knew Steve wouldn't screw up. "You." Tony's eyes turned glacial. Steve was wrong, but wouldn't budge. He was willing to let bygones be bygones, and act like nothing happened if he came back. "Tony, I'm sorry." Tony couldn't believe Hawkeye Barton was switching sides. He was standing next to Steve, looking resolved. "I think you're going overboard." He believed Steve, that Bucky was innocent. He'd seen a lot of things, and he trusted Captain America. He didn't know how this would end, but this was the right thing to do. "Barton. You." Tony was stunned that Barton would turn on him. He'd been okay if he'd stayed neutral, but standing with Captain America? He was already mad. and now he was seeing red. He turned and said, "Anyone else want out? I don't want to take sides, I just want everyone to talk." Wanda stood to the side, saying, "I don't want to hurt anyone," that she knew that with her powers, she could tip the scales for either side, but that wasn't what she wanted. She just wanted everyone to get along. Thor shrugged and said, "I'm just here to watch," that he didn't know the details, and wasn't getting involved. The vision said, "Tony, I trust you." Black Widow Natasha stood behind Tony, saying nothing, but she looked conflicted. Steve and Tony looked at each other, both making their choices clear. Then, everyone surged forward. Tony and Steve collided, neither holding back. "Let me through." Steve blocked Tony's punch, and smashed Tony's face with his shield. Tony didn't answer, but stepped in, firing his repulsor rays. Steve blocked it with his shield. Falcon Sam was circling in the sky, and War Machine went after him, because they used to be friends. Rhodes didn't launch missiles, but dogged Sam's every move, trying to knock him out of the sky. The two circled in the air. Falcon couldn't fight back, not even to do a U-turn. Hawkeye Barton took on Black Widow Natasha. The others were basically superheroes. "Bucky, get out of here!" Steve yelled at Bucky, who was dodging vision. If they kept fighting, it would be a stalemate. Once Bucky was gone, there was no reason to fight. Bucky ran, but a guy in a black suit kicked him. It was Black Panther T'Challa. The scene was a mess. Steve tried to help Bucky, but Vision went after him. Ant-Man was trying to disable Iron Man, but he was knocked away by the fire extinguishing system. Wanda watched, unable to make a move. When she saw Black Panther about to kill Bucky, she used her chaos magic to throw Black Panther away. War Machine had spotted Bucky, defenseless. He was about to go after him, but suddenly looked horrified. He looked back and saw Ant-Man had grown, and was dragging his leg. Everyone froze. They stopped fighting and stared. "That's so cool. It gets bigger." Thor was watching, his eyes wide. For a second, he wanted to try it. While everyone was distracted, Steve and Bucky ran toward the airport, but Tony flew low and tackled Steve. They were punching and kicking, but neither could hurt the other. Suddenly, two short swords flew through the air and stuck in the ground. Terrifying green energy exploded. Everyone was thrown back by the shockwave. "Stop!" A noble woman in black walked forward. Her voice was calm, but it echoed in everyone's ears. Her presence made everyone stop fighting. Her voice made everyone afraid. Everyone looked at her. The goddess of death, Hela, had arrived. Chapter 78. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hela. Thor's smile vanished the second he saw her. He hadn't expected Hela to show up here. The pressure was intense, and his earlier arrogance evaporated. He could feel the raw power radiating from his sister, the goddess of death. Steve and Tony, mid-fight on the ground, felt the hairs on their necks prickle when Hela appeared. They instantly stopped fighting, eyes locked on the goddess of death. Even though they were at each other's throats, an external threat instantly united them. Even Black Panther, consumed by vengeance for his father, stopped chasing Bucky and focused on Hela. Under the oppressive dread of death, they knew a civil war had to wait. Slowly, they formed a united front, facing Hela. Even Wanda's eyes betrayed her fear. She knew this was no ordinary enemy. "Hela, Asgard has no claim on Earth." Tony stood his ground, not far from her, teeth gritted as he stared her down. He knew she wasn't here to watch a brawl, and he hadn't forgotten Odin's orders. He just hadn't expected to meet her here. Her uninvited arrival spelled trouble. "Ha! You think I care?" Hela sneered, turning her gaze to the towering structure behind them. "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't waste my time with your mess." She had zero interest in these Midgardians. In her eyes, they were weak. As for her brother Thor, he was irrelevant. As Hela turned, everyone followed her line of sight. A figure stood atop the tower in the distance, a dark mist swirling around him like a black flame. The moment they saw him, a wave of primal dread washed over them. It was physical and mental. He stood motionless, but his mere presence made it hard to breathe. A single glance was all it took to identify him. "It's the guy from Orchard Beach." Tony's voice was grave, even though the man's face was obscured by shadows. That oppressive feeling confirmed it. This was the mysterious man. This was the closest they'd been to him, and the closer they got, the more terrified they were. Hela's arrival had already triggered alarms, but this guy. He was 10 times worse. Their DNA screamed run, that they felt like he could tear them apart on a whim. They stood frozen, expressions grim, eyes fixed on the figure. Only Wanda visibly relaxed. Hood was here. She knew that with Hood around, the fighting was over. If he wanted, he could control everyone in this place. A flicker of excitement ran through her. Hood had come, despite the distance, meaning he cared about her, but then something felt off. Wait, why did Hood bring Hela, the goddess of death? She'd heard Thor's stories on the plane. She couldn't believe this monster worked for Hood, and she had a strange, unsettling thought: were Hood and Hela involved? Meanwhile, on the tower, Hood looked down at the assembled heroes. This is almost enough to break my brain, that he knew the Avengers' plot, but the butterfly effect of his actions had changed things considerably. For one thing, no Peter Parker. There was a Gwen, but she was nowhere near this battle. He also hadn't expected Thor to show up. A second's thought told him Odin probably sent Thor to find Hela. Hela, whatever you do, you can't stay on Earth. Tony glared at Hela, left-hand cannon ready to fire. If she refused, they'd have to fight. Earth's safety was more important than Bucky. No one from Asgard was safe. And judging by the feeling of dread, Hela was strong. Her entrance had made that obvious. Plus, there was the mysterious man behind her. He might be Wanda's boyfriend, but they couldn't be sure whose side he was on. If he turned out to be the enemy, it'd be a nightmare. Bang, star, Tony blasted off, landing in front of the others. The force of his landing cracked the concrete. Thor's hammer floated to his side. He grabbed it, staring at Hela. Hela, you broke your imprisonment without permission, and Father is furious. He. Father, Hela, composed until now, snapped. You dare use that word to me, you little bastard. Odin, that damn man, kept her locked away for centuries. She nearly went insane. If the Phoenix Force hadn't intervened, she'd still be trapped there. Father, the word was a joke. Show some respect to Father. Even though you're my sister, that doesn't excuse your behavior. Thor gripped his hammer, lightning crackling in his eyes. He hoped she'd return to Asgard and face Odin's judgment. Hela might be powerful, but he wasn't afraid. You. Trash like you, my brother. Hela's smile was vicious. You're weak. Tell the old man Odin to face me himself. She might be a goddess, but Thor didn't register on her radar. She looked at him calmly, a hint of amusement in her eyes. He was pathetic. She felt nothing. Show some respect. Thor was already angry, but Hela's insult to Odin sent him over the edge. He'd always respected his father. Respect? Forget it. Hela sneered. Odin was just an old man who should have died. On the tower, Hood smiled. Changing the story was fun. He'd brought Hela for this. With her power, she could flatten the Avengers. They only unite when they share a common goal. He knew these guys. They only played well together when the stakes were high. As for what happened next, he'd stay out of it. Hood's lips curved. What was better than watching a play? Like controlling the plot, watching it unfold. He felt a little wicked. This guy. Wanda saw Hood, hands in his pockets. Even without seeing his face, she knew he was enjoying this. She shook her head. Still, it was clever. At least everyone was focused on Hela. Enough talk. Let's go. War Machine Rod launched 2 missiles from his shoulders, fiery trails heading straight for Hela. Everyone moved. Hawkeye Barton fired an arrow that split into a dozen mid-air. Tony raised his left hand, firing his palm cannon as the armor behind him opened, launching more ammunition at Hela. He charged forward, joining the attack. Vision rose into the air, golden energy flashing between his brows, a laser beam aimed at Hela. Black Widow Natasha ran to the side, firing her pistols. The Avengers unleashed their strongest ranged attacks. They knew Hela was no pushover. Is that all? Hela smirked, her eyes gleaming with contempt. She flicked her right hand, and the missiles exploded in a flash of green light. The bullets and arrows froze in mid-air, falling to the ground. She yanked her left hand down, and Vision was pulled back, crashing to the ground. Only his bald head remained visible. Their best ranged attacks were neutralized in seconds. Take this. Steve charged in, throwing his shield. The spinning shield screamed through the air. Hela caught it. A shield? Cute toy. She tossed it up, hooked it with her finger, and sent it back at Steve. It hurtled toward him, and Steve's eyes widened. He braced, catching the shield, but as it made contact, his pupils shrank. Bang, star. Steve flew backward, the shield slamming him into a shipping container. Before Hela could react, Tony dove in, flames blasting. He spun in the air, thrusters firing. His hand morphed into a black and red hammer. He slammed it down on Hela's head. A grin flickered across his face. At this range, she couldn't dodge. Boom. Star. Tony's eyes widened in horror. His best attack was blocked by a green, film-like barrier. Hela tilted her head and smiled. Fear surged through Tony. His sixth sense screamed. Hela casually flicked her wrist. Warning. The mech is seriously damaged. Damage level is 80%. Star. With a single blow, Tony crashed into the airport lobby. Bucky and Natasha flanked Hela. Bucky swung his metal arm, the air crackling as it slammed into Hela's abdomen. Natasha rolled toward Hela's feet, her dagger slashing at her hamstring. Their teamwork was perfect. Hela couldn't defend against both attacks. So, Midgardian fighting skills are weak. Hela shook her head, kicking Natasha's wrist. She swung her hand, sending Natasha tumbling. She rolled before barely stopping. The dagger flew, and Hela's left hand grabbed Bucky's metal arm. Click, click, click. Star. Fear flashed across Bucky's face as his metal arm cracked. Hela grabbed the dagger. She plunged it into Bucky's other shoulder, and kicked him backward. Take my move. Sam swooped down, wings blazing, red lasers fired from his wings. Black Panther appeared behind Hela, ready to choke her out. If Sam seized the moment, Hela would be vulnerable, but before Black Panther could touch Hela, he was launched into the air, smashing into Sam. They both slammed into the ground. Hela caught one of Sam's wings and flung it at Patton. In less than 30 seconds, most of the Avengers were down. A bunch of trash. Hela glared at them. Boom. Star. Lightning flashed as storm clouds gathered. Try this. Thor jumped, lightning coursing through him. He hurled Mjolnir, lightning illuminating the ground. Hela casually raised her hand. Buzz. Star. Everyone froze. Thor's eyes bulged. No one could lift Mjolnir. They stared in disbelief. Hela caught Thor's hammer in one hand. He gave this to you. You don't deserve it. Hela sneered and squeezed. Lightning flashed, and Mjolnir shook. Crack, crack. Star. Crack spread across the hammer. It shattered, lightning exploding outward. Rumble. Star. The thunder was Mjolnir's final cry. Chapter 79. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Boom. Mjolnir shattered. Pieces scattered across the ground. Thor's eyes widened. How could this be? It was you metal. She didn't just take it, she crushed it. Impossible. He gaped, a mess of emotions swirling within him. How? Tony's armor was trashed, his faceplate gone. He leaned against the airport's second-floor railing, staring at the wreckage. His eyes narrowed, his heart pounded. How strong was Hela? They'd fought together, and she hadn't even been scratched. They were the ones who went down. Captain America stumbled out of a cargo container. He froze, staring. He'd faced tough odds before, but this felt different. Even if they all ganged up on her, they wouldn't stand a chance. Everyone struggled to their feet, fear etched on their faces. Thor had bragged about Mjolnir countless times. He'd called it the most powerful weapon, as precious as a lover, and she just casually crushed it. Hela had been summoned by some mystery man. How? The question haunted them. They'd clearly seen her taking orders from him. The enemy was too strong, and that was before the guy in charge got involved. If he joined the fight, who knew what would happen? They knew next to nothing about him. Only Wanda watched in utter disbelief. She knew it was Hood, but how did he know Hela? More importantly, why would the goddess of death say she was intervening because of Hood? How could such a powerful being obey him? Her own powers were growing, but even now, she couldn't match that display. She knew that joining the fight would be pointless. Hela was too powerful, and she carried herself with such ease. She was confident she'd already won. It made no sense. Damn it. You broke Mjolnir, Thor roared, his eyes blazing, his favorite weapon, destroyed like that. Dark clouds swirled overhead, thunder rumbling, lightning flashed, but without Mjolnir, he couldn't summon it. He charged at Hela, each step leaving a deep dent in the concrete. Die! He threw a haymaker, preparing to follow with an uppercut. You remind me a little of the old man, but you're much weaker. Hela watched him come, her voice mocking. She dodged his attacks with effortless grace, the contempt in her eyes fueled his rage. He'd never imagined she'd be this strong, but he wouldn't back down. He kept attacking, yelling, "Stop hiding!" Ha! Hela's lips curled into a smirk, her left fist shot out, hitting Thor square in the face. She blurred behind him, grabbed his collar, and slammed him face first into the ground, dragging him across the airport. She tossed him into the air, spun, and kicked him away. It was so fast, no one could react. Thor lay sprawled on the ground. Thor! Everyone surged forward, but Hela raised her hand, a massive beam of energy blasted down from the sky. Boom! The force threw everyone back, even those far away struggled against the shockwave. It was a scene that bred despair. They pushed themselves up, bruised and battered. They were too injured to fight back. Hela was just too strong. Ugh! Thor slowly sat up, coughing, blood trickling from his mouth. Every inch of his body screamed. Hela was stronger than anyone he'd ever fought. He thought maybe his father, Odin, was the only one who could match her. He finally understood why Odin had told him to report Hela's appearance, not to fight her, because he was outmatched. Pathetic! Hela sneered at Thor, his face in the dirt, but there was something else in her eyes, jealousy. She was jealous of this loser. I'm not pathetic, Thor growled, pushing himself up, defiance in his voice. He wasn't weak. Not pathetic, Hela scoffed, tilting her head. That damn old man wanted to make you king. How could someone so weak be king? He'd been given everything, and this was all he could do. She'd effortlessly beaten him. She was the one who should be king. She was the only one strong enough, and she couldn't accept that this guy was her little brother. I'm not. Thor clenched his fists, his face tight with frustration. For the first time, he felt truly weak. He'd thought he could hold his own against her, but he'd been taken down in seconds. Worse, he couldn't even touch her. He gritted his teeth, time seemed to slow, and light shimmered around him. He lunged at Hela, a fist crackling with energy aimed at her face, but Hela blocked it with a punch of her own, grabbing his throat and lifting him off the ground. He clawed at her hand, desperate for air, but couldn't break her grip. My dear, innocent brother, what kind of god are you? Where's all that thunder and lightning you're so proud of? Hela mocked, her words like shards of glass. He was the god of thunder, but without Mjolnir, he couldn't even call down lightning. He was just a brawler, and it filled him with rage. Hela threw him aside, bang. He flew through the air, skidding to a halt after 10 meters. Arg! The impact knocked the wind out of him. Everything he believed about himself was wrong. He was supposed to be powerful, but he couldn't even hurt his sister. Read more at Falun Novel Network. Damn it! Damn it! Damn it! You're a failure! Thor screamed, scrambling to his feet. The lightning above intensified, and the dark cloud seemed to press down. He charged at Hela, a man possessed. The storm responded to his rage, lightning flashing, lightning sparked in his eyes, and he launched himself forward. Anger surged through him. Just as he jumped, Hela rose, green energy surrounded her fist, and she smashed him out of the air. Thor crashed through several warehouses, dust and debris filled the air, and one warehouse collapsed. Why? Why? Thor roared, pounding the ground, his face a mask of despair. He tried to summon the lightning, but without Mjolnir, he was powerless. He couldn't even touch her. Why? Because you're too weak. Hela reveled in Thor's breakdown. She wanted to see him helpless, broken on the ground. Then, Thor slowly stood. His eyes were bloodshot, and in the next instant, faint lightning crackled within them. He walked toward Hela, his pace quickening. He broke into a run, his body surging with energy. Lines of light streaked around him. He was a cannonball heading straight for Hela, driven by fury. His power was growing. He could almost see her moves, almost keep up. He threw a punch, his eyes burning, so close. His fist was inches from her face. The force of his blow cracked the ground around them. Then, he saw a smile on Hela's face, pain. He looked down and saw Hela's fist buried in his gut. Agony ripped through his body. One uppercut launched him skyward. Hela leaped into the air, the ground cracking beneath her. she grabbed his head, slamming it against the clouds, then brought him crashing down. Thor was a meteor, smashing into the earth, fire trailed his body. Boom! The ground exploded, leaving a crater 30 meters wide, debris rained down, and Thor lay embedded in the ground. Enough! Stop! Wanda couldn't bear to watch the one-sided beating. Hood wouldn't let her kill him, but if this kept up, Thor would be crippled. There was no point, he couldn't even fight back. Click, Hela landed beside Thor and stepped on his head. Don't blame me. Talk to him. Hela smiled, glancing at the figure on the tower. She was just following orders. Her job was to stop the fight, and knocking everyone out was the easiest way to do that. Ugh. Hood coughed from the tower. Hela lifted her foot and stepped back, smiling. Thor, finally freed, gasped for air. He couldn't understand how he and his sister could be so different. How had he become so weak? He lay on the ground, broken and defeated, glaring at Hela. You'll never be strong enough to beat me. Hela sneered. Thor was a disappointment. If Hood hadn't given her orders, she could have wiped out everyone present. These Midgardians were insects, they weren't even worth her time. Tony and the others saw Thor's plight, but they were too injured to help. Tony's armor was wrecked, Steve could barely stand. They stared at the figure on the tower in despair. He stood in the sun, a mysterious figure. There's no need to fight over meaningless things. The voice echoed in their minds. The figure on the tower floated into the air and walked toward them. Chapter 80. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Alright, everyone, chill. Hod floated up, hovering above the group. They shielded their eyes, looking up at him. The sun was right behind Hod's head, blinding them. Even squinting, they could only make out his silhouette. His clothes just looked like a dark suit. Who the heck is this guy? Tony stared. The black fog had cleared, but the man's face was still a blur. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember what the guy looked like. It was weird, like he'd forget the instant he saw it, but even stranger, he felt like he knew him from somewhere, though he couldn't place it. The other Avengers strained to see the face too, but they saw the same thing Tony did, nothing. Or worse, they'd see it and then forget it. A strange power seemed to wrap around them, calming their jangled nerves. Tony felt it most acutely. He felt clarity wash over him, and everything that had happened rushed back. What am I doing? I have other ways to solve this. Why did I choose the most extreme? The voice seemed to cleanse their souls, and the more that happened, the more scared they became. The power was terrifying, forcing them to abandon distractions and actually think. With the sun blazing, the figure of the mystery man was like a dark cloud over their hearts. If Hela made them feel desperate, this guy inspired pure, unadulterated fear, deep-seated, gut-wrenching fear. Even Hela, as powerful as she was, obeyed this man. That meant he was way stronger than her, and they couldn't even handle Hela. The messed up part was, they'd held meetings specifically about this guy. They had planned what they'd do if he ever turned into an enemy. Now, it looked like no matter how hard they fought, they wouldn't stand a chance. Only one person seemed unaffected, Wanda. He still likes to put on a show. Wanda looked up at Hod and shook her head, amused. Anyone else would think he was a god. Oh, wait, even Hela, the actual goddess of death, was taking orders from Hod. How many secrets does this guy have? He just keeps getting weirder. Wanda wondered. Every time she thought she understood him, another layer appeared. Buzz Hod gestured, and a golden portal opened in the air. Someone fell out of the 3-meter-high sky. Bang, they hit the ground hard, groaning. It was a German guy, and he was a mess. His clothes were torn, and his skin was covered in cuts and bruises. Someone had definitely been beating him up, otherwise he wouldn't have so many scars. Looking for the mastermind? Here he is. Hod shrugged. He liked watching the drama. As a time traveler, watching the MCU play out live was way more fun than binge-watching on Disney+. It was like watching a really intense movie. The mastermind? Tony focused on the new arrival, his anger simmering down. He had sensed something was off, like they were being manipulated. Even their actions felt strange. Steve might stand by his friend, but he was an honest guy. He probably wasn't lying about Bucky's involvement. Black Panther frowned, still trying to piece everything together, but the mysterious man's tone suggested this was more than a simple act of terrorism. Chala, this guy planned your father's death in the explosion. Bucky had nothing to do with it. Zemo used hypnotic instructions left by Hydra to control Bucky. Zemo did all of this because his family died in Sokovia. Hod laid it all out. Honestly, Zemo was just a tragic figure. One mistake cost him his family. It was understandable that he was angry. Black Panther replayed the events in his mind, veins bulging in his forehead, his eyes burning with rage. If he wasn't injured, he would have torn Zemo limb from limb. Wanda and the others looked at each other, conflicted. They were partially responsible for this. Their actions had led to Zemo losing his family. Silence fell over the group. Everyone lowered their heads, watching what was happening. "He's all yours." Hod turned to Hela. "Let's go, Hela." "Right." Hela nodded and prepared to fly off, but Thor's voice, hoarse and strained, stopped her. "Hela, come home. Come see Odin." He strained to stand, fighting through the pain. Sweat poured down his face. This battle had taken a heavy toll. He just wanted Hela to come back with him peacefully. "You're pathetic." Hela scoffed. "Go back. Tell Odin to come here himself. Or I'll fight my way back to Asgard one day." That she couldn't believe her brother was so dense. She wasn't going back unless Odin gave up his throne and died right in front of her. The centuries of imprisonment still stung. "You're stubborn. You can't beat your father like this." Thor clutched his chest and yelled. If Odin came, there would only be one outcome for Hela. Death. Then he should kill me. Otherwise, I'll kill him. With that, Hela shot towards Hod. She was done talking to this weakling. Even if he was her brother, strength was all that mattered. Thor grit his teeth, blood trickling down his chin, his legs trembled, his thighs corded with muscle, his eyes burning with fury. He was no longer focused on Hela, but on the mysterious man above. He didn't know why Hela listened to him, but he was ready to fight. "Thor! Don't do it. Come back. You can't beat him." The Avengers were frantic. Thor couldn't beat Hela, let alone this guy. As Thor closed the distance, lightning crackled around his fist. "Still got some fight left, huh?" Hod looked down at Thor, a smile playing on his lips. The Asgardians really were tough. Even beaten and bruised, they kept coming. He pushed down slightly with his right hand, and an indescribable pressure slammed into Thor. He felt an overwhelming force bearing down on him. Whoosh, star. Bang, star. Thor was slammed into the ground, head first. Only his head was visible. The ground around him cracked and tightened, trapping him. "Idiot." Hod watched Thor struggle. "Friday, did you pick anything up?" Tony asked, gritting his teeth as he held his damaged earpiece. "Boss, the power signature matches the residual energy from the earthquake." Tony's face fell. He had suspected the earthquake was connected to something, so he had checked it out, but he didn't see any connection to the mystery man, so he had dismissed it. He never imagined this guy could wield that kind of power at the same time. An 8-point earthquake. That was enough to flatten a city. Tony looked at Hod with a new level of fear. This guy was a walking natural disaster. They were completely outmatched. "Let's go." Hod waved his hand, and a golden portal opened above him, a golden flash, and they were gone. Everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief. That was way too close. That goddess of death was terrifying. And the mystery man is even worse. We don't even know what he wants. He seems to want to help us, but this isn't the way to do it. I don't see anything in the world that could stop him. The Avengers collapsed, grateful to be alive. The mystery man hadn't even cast any spells, but his presence alone had been terrifying. They could just barely bring themselves to attack the goddess of death Hela, but they didn't even have the courage to attack this mystery man. His strange power could change their emotions and calm them down. The more they experienced that, the more they understood the difference in power. It's finally over. Tony tore off a piece of his armor and sat down, exhausted. Without the mystery man, he didn't know what would have happened. After a long rest, Tony stood and walked towards Steve. The others tensed up, unsure of what was about to happen. Tony reached Steve, who was leaning against the warehouse wall, and held out his hand. Steve looked up, surprised. Seeing Tony smile, he grabbed his hand and pulled himself up. "Captain, I screwed up. I'm sorry. Tony took a deep breath. We didn't need to fight like that. I was too impulsive. Ross just got to me. Steve shook his head, admitting his mistake. They were teammates, after all. There was no need for this. All right, knock it off. Natasha stepped between them, smoothing her hair. Let's turn the guy over to Ross and go back to the party. That they had completed their mission perfectly. Wanda smiled. This was what she wanted to see. Back at the Avengers compound, after patching themselves up, everyone gathered around the table. Everyone seemed to be in a good mood, except Thor, who was quietly munching on a cookie. Wanda, who's your boyfriend? Tony asked. He had guessed that the guy was there to help them, otherwise, Zemo wouldn't have been caught, and they wouldn't have learned the truth. He wanted to know who this guy was. What kind of person could make the goddess of death listen to him? I don't know what to say. I'll bring him around sometime. Wanda looked flustered. They were together, but Hood's situation was complicated. She even thought Hood might have somehow subdued Hela. I'm looking forward to it. I'll throw a party. Tony grinned. This mystery man was so strong. If he became one of them, the Avengers would be unstoppable. I'm going to skip the food. I need to get to Asgard. Thor crammed a waffle into his mouth and stood up. He jumped out the window. Everyone sighed. Thor had taken a big hit this time. Asgard. Did you see her? Odin watched Thor, guessing what had happened. He wasn't surprised. His son still had much to learn. It was natural that he couldn't beat Hela now. I did, but Hela. She's working for a Midgardian. Thor told Odin everything. Odin was stunned. He knew how proud Hela was, but she had submitted to someone else. Even he couldn't make her submit, only imprison her. If so, the person who helped Hela escape is likely the mystery man, Odin concluded. It was the most likely explanation. Father, what do I do? Thor asked, frustrated. Odin was silent for a long time before saying. The Midgardian you speak of is very powerful. I'm afraid I must go and meet him.